Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were men that were dancing, creeping, and crooked, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's a tantalus? Or a gasogene? And what's the difference between a hansom cab and a four-wheeler?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 283, Hocus Pocus. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you ready to work some magic with me here today?
I am. You know, it's just an amazing coincidence, but here, as we're recording, I just happen to be wearing my tailcoat and top hat, and I don't know where these bunnies came from. Wait a minute. Let me see if I can get them back in the hat. Hold on a minute.
Well, I took my top hat out and I pulled a lion out of it.
Oh, you must be Bullwinkle.
I take it 7.5.
That trick never works.
This time for sure. Well, for everyone who doesn't know what we're talking about, go look up Rocky and Bullwinkle, why don't you? In the meantime, Why don't you look up the show notes to this episode, which are available at ihose.co/trifles283, all in lowercase. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site, where we will have any kinds of extra material that you need to go look up or gather more information about. Certainly, you can leave us a comment right there in the show notes for this episode. Tell us what you think of this. If you have any feedback, maybe you can identify some of the things that we will invariably miss in this particular episode. And while you're there, we would love it if you would become a patron. Becoming a patron of Sherlock, of Trifles, gives you the opportunity to get bonus material that we put out from time to time. We occasionally even have a bloopers reel. Can you believe it? We actually make mistakes on this show. Well, mistakes other than actually publishing it, that is. But for as little as $1 a month, you can get those bonus pieces of content. And if you up the ante a little bit, we even have some merch for you. I think we have a wonderful Trifles mug if you'd like to get your own mug to enjoy a beverage, cold or hot, while you're listening to the show. So go for it. Well, this episode is cryptically entitled Hocus Pocus. And in this case, what it really means is we are going to be talking about magic in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Now, Bert, I don't know if you are a fan or an amateur fan of magic, as I am. Certainly not an expert on it, like someone like, say Dan Stassower is, who's written about Harry Houdini. But when I mention magic, does anything spring to mind as far as Sherlock Holmes goes?
Oh, well, I'd answer that in a couple of ways. First of all, I am a big fan of magic, and like many people, when I was a kid, I was particularly into magic, and my father had an uncle who was a clown and a ventriloquist and a magician, and I remember when I was a little boy, him showing me some tricks. But yeah, in terms of Sherlock Holmes, there are a couple, certainly. Holmes is frequently accused of magic and occasionally refers to it. He at one point says very apologetically, Watson will tell you that I never can resist a touch of the dramatic. And that's kind of magical. But, the other thing is that in some stories, there is the appearance of magic, and I'm just thinking about the Mazarin Stone, in which Holmes, of course, this began as a bit of stagecraft, I think, but Holmes appears to have magically transmitted himself from his bedroom or from his room away to this niche behind the curtains. And he has a record playing, which magically seems to indicate that he's playing the violin in another room when he's really listening to these evildoers. So there are things like that, but there are more specific references, to magic and supernatural occasionally in the canon.
Yeah, and I love your visualization there, the stagecraft, the sleight of hand, as it were, distracting someone in one area and putting their attention on another. I think the Mazarin Stone is a perfect example of that. Of course, in the last episode, we talked about Sherlock Holmes's tours de force, and these are instances when he demonstrates his powers. And as you say, in a number of instances like that, people are bowled over. They are wowed by it. And in one case, I know in the Barrel Coronet, when he was talking with Mr. Holder, he said, he asked about Francis Prosper. And he says, oh, yes, he's the greengrocer who brings our vegetables around. And Holmes says, yeah, he stood to the left of the door, that is to say, farther up the path than necessary to reach the door. Yes, he did. And is he a man with a wooden leg? Well, and this Miss Holder was in the conversation here, and Watson says, something like fear sprang up in the young lady's expressive black eyes. Why, you are like a magician, said she. How do you know that?
And then Holmes always ruins the discussion by handing back her watch and wallet.
Oh yeah, I can just picture him opening his frock coat, and there's a whole bunch of watches down the inner the inner lining there.
But it's worth pointing out that the Victorian era was the era of great illusionists. This is 1897, the 1890s. And now, particularly with the rise of optical technology in the cinema, you had optical projection and magic tricks, and this was a big deal in the music hall and on the bills of fare. So, mechanical development, devices and stage props and things like that made it easy for things to appear and disappear.
Indeed. And this was still about 100 years after the appearance of Franz Anton Mesmer, who arrived in Paris in 1778, and he presented a theory of animal magnetism to local physicians, and established himself as an authority in this area. And this is, of course, where we get the word mesmerize from. And it was really just a ruse. He was nothing more than a high-end magician, kind of doing his thing 100 years before Holmes's time. And certainly a good 50 years or so before the Victorian era began.
Yeah, that's true. But even in different corners of the world of Sherlock Holmes, and we're going to be talking beyond these in a moment or two, you do have magic in the sense that you've got things like cheating at cards. And in fact, I remember there was a magician named Maskelyne who was a big documenter of card-sharp kinds of practices. And we have Colonel Sebastian Moran cheating at cards. And in fact, Maskelyne had written this book called, a revelation of how to cheat at games of chance and skill. So that was a big thing. Maskelyne was a stage magician in England, and he also invented the pay toilet, of all things.
Well, how do you like that?
Yeah, a little bit of magic right there.
And if we return to the stories, other instances of Holmes being thought of as a magician, in The Sussex Vampire, you recall that Mrs. Ferguson was holed up in her bedroom with the baby. And when she and her husband were finally reconciling, she said, "How could I tell you, Bob? I felt the blow it would be to you." It was better that I should wait and that it should come from some other lips than mine. When this gentleman, who seems to have powers of magic, wrote that he knew all, I was glad.
Yeah, seems to have powers of magic indeed. Well, that's sort of a constant reference to Sherlock Holmes.
Indeed, indeed. So we mentioned Hocus Pocus in the title for this episode, and believe it or not, Hocus Pocus does appear in the canon. I was surprised to find it. You can do a word search through PDF versions of the Sherlock Holmes stories and find a reference to just about anything. And in this case, we take ourselves to the sign of 4. And Thaddeus Sholto was found in that rigor mortis state in his little study there, and the door was locked from the inside. Of course, he had been hit by the dart from Tonga, the poisoned dart, and there was a card left there with a reference to the sign of 4. And Athelney Jones was there. He said, confirms it in every respect. The house is full of Indian curiosities. Thaddeus brought this up, and if this splinter be poisonous, Thaddeus may well have had murderous use of it as any other man. Excuse me, it was Bartholomew who was dead, not Thaddeus.
Right.
The card is some hocus pocus, a blind, as like as it's not. The only question is, how did he depart? Well, clearly by magic, then. So yeah, it's Athelney Jones there. Saying that the card was meant to be a bit of hocus pocus, a little bit of distraction while attention is elsewhere.
Well, it's a very good point, because that's also one of the few instances. There are a couple maybe, but the few instances in the world of Sherlock Holmes where we are presented with what's essentially a locked room mystery. Now, of course, the mystery doesn't last very long, thanks to Sherlock Holmes, but you wind up with this person inexplicably dead, and it seems that there's no way to get in or out of the room. And we saw a little whisper of that, of course, also in The Speckled Band.
Yeah, exactly so. And it is up to Holmes to kind of undo this so-called magic. Well, we are going to ask you to undo yourself from our episode for just a moment. We're going to have a word from our sponsor, and when we come back, we'll be talking about sorcery, wizardry, and something that goes all the way back to the 6th century. Stay tuned. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to bakerstreetirregulars.com today. Okay, we are back in the magical world of Sherlock Holmes. It really is a magical place with characters and settings. And, Conan Doyle, of course, did a wondrous job with the supernatural. But again, it's just in terms of Holmes's methods being applied in a society where they valued certainty and the scientific over the uncertain. It's almost as if Victorians were balancing these two simultaneous world views, where they did still very much believe in the supernatural to a certain extent, but they also put their faith in more of the scientific as well.
Well, that's true, and there's a complement to that, of course, Arthur Clarke years later would write that basically there's no way of distinguishing between advanced technology and magic under certain circumstances. But if you imagine what the Victorian perspective was like, the idea of a telephone, being able to speak and hear the voice of someone who is tens or hundreds of miles away, the experiments, the discoveries, the scientific advancements, it seemed as if, there was a world of magical things to uncover. And of course, Conan Doyle, when he wrote his testament to literature and his list, his book, his memoir of all the great books that he'd read and what they'd meant to him, called it Through the Magic Door, the magic door of the library.
Yes, that is true. Boy, oh boy. And what magic, the world of literature brings us. And it doesn't even need to be just literature per se. I mean, anything we read takes us to, transports us to a different place and time, even if it's just in our minds. Well, let's look at these mentions of wizardry, sorcery, etc. And interestingly enough, the four references that I have to Holmes being a wizard or a sorcerer all come from the late part of the return of Sherlock Holmes and into the case book. So these are later stories. These are Holmes being written about post-1900. Which kind of conforms with Conan Doyle's own time exploring spiritualism more and more. I just wanted to kind of note that in terms of the timeline. In the Abbey Grange, Stanley Hopkins, of course, was handling the Abbey Grange. They were looking for the silver that had supposedly been stolen by this gang that Captain Crocker and Teresa came up with to kind of deflect the attention. Again, kind of a ruse there. And Hopkins, I think Holmes told Hopkins to look in the pond for the silver. And he says, "I do believe you are a wizard, Mr. Holmes. I really do sometimes think you have powers that are not human. Now, how on earth could you know that the stolen silver was at the bottom of the pond?" And Holmes said, "I didn't know it." So that's one instance. And the next one is in the second stand, and this is a wonderful twofer. Again, there is a missing document. The Right Honorable Trelawney Hope is out of his gourd trying to look for it, and he says, and Holmes finally gets it back into the box. And he says, thank you, what a weight from my heart. But this is inconceivable, impossible. Mr. Holmes, you are a wizard, a sorcerer. How did you know it was there? And Holmes said, because I knew it was nowhere else. So, again, as you said early on, this is an instance of Holmes is kind of giving away the game. And again, with his observations about James Dodd in The Blanched Soldier. He had deduced that he was part of the military in South Africa, and Dodd acknowledges it, saying, "That is so, Mr. Holmes. You are a wizard." Wizard. And then one more mention in The Retired Colorman, and in fact, it was Watson this time around. Watson went on that scouting trip for Holmes, an advance guard, so to speak, and Holmes said, Watson said someone was following me. Holmes said, yes, no doubt. A tall, dark, heavily mustached man, you say, with gray-tinted sunglasses? Holmes, you are a wizard. I did not say so, but he had gray-tinted sunglasses. It seems a little odd that at that point Watson would be calling Holmes a wizard, since he knew his skills quite well by that point.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, and then when you think of these great moments, and we've, of course, talked about them in a prior episode, these tours de force, and maybe we'll come back to that again, but you can't do better than the naval treaty, which if we had not seen everything leading up to it, you can imagine how impressive it would have been when sitting down at breakfast, Sherlock Holmes takes a cover off of a dish, and voila, there is the missing document that you've been searching for months.
Exactly. Well, and we did mention one of the one of the tours de force last time, and I believe it was in A Scandal in Bohemia, when Holmes and Watson are together, and Holmes hasn't seen Watson for some time, and acknowledges that Watson had gained a little weight. I think he said he had gained 7.5 pounds. And Watson said, I think it was only 7, Holmes. And Holmes says...
a trifle more.
Trifle more, yes. Trifle more. And he says, tell me how... he says, you didn't tell me that you intended to go into harness, meaning back into active practice. And... Holmes says, well, I deduced it. You've been getting yourself wet lately. You have a clumsy and careless servant girl. And here Watson says, my dear Holmes, this is too much. You would certainly have been burned had you lived a few centuries ago.
Burn already!
Oh, but here this leads us into kind of the fanciful, and if Holmes lived certain centuries ago, would he indeed have been burned? I mean, this reminds me of a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. This novel by Mark Twain, where it's a time travel scenario, and this Connecticut gentleman lands in King Arthur's Court, 528 A.D., and he was condemned to be burned at the stake. And knowing the calendar as he did, and it's a good thing he was able to calculate for the Gregorian calendar, he predicted that the end of the world was nigh because he knew when a solar eclipse was going to happen. And this wowed everyone into believing that he was indeed a sorcerer and that they should not burn him at the stake.
Well, you have that recurring theme in fiction, too. And there are, in other fictions, that's a wonderful example. But I'm thinking, too, of a television program that's very popular with some people called The Outlander, in which a woman goes back in time to the early days of wars in Scotland. And, of course, she is a medical professional. I think she's a nurse or a doctor. And so she has a knowledge of what plants and what available herbs and things like that can do to heal. And you become aware again of Arthur Clarke's observation that, any really advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And she's pretty close to being thought of as a witch, before folks realize that it's a good thing to have a healer around.
Yeah. Well, the good news is that it wasn't Sherlock Holmes that was in King Arthur's Court, because with his knowledge of astronomy being nil, there's no way he could have predicted a solar eclipse, because he didn't care whether the Earth went around the sun or vice versa.
No, but he could have operated a very profitable guess your weight concession at a local fairground, but then that's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Remarkable. This is inconceivable. Impossible, Mr. Holmes. How did you know it was here?
Because I knew it was nowhere else.